Hey, what's going on? It's Stu here. In this video, I'm going to do a cell phone collection of May 2019. So yeah, enjoy. So first off, we have the HTC One V. It works perfectly fine. I really love this device and is in mint condition, which is cool. Next up is the HTC Desire 300. It also works perfectly fine, but the screen's a little bit cracked. But other than that, it works totally fine as well. Next up is one of the two Samsung Galaxy Youngs. This is the first one, and it works perfectly fine. As you can see right now, it's on. It is my very first smartphone and my very first Android phone, which is cool. I love it. It works perfectly. I like it. Next up is the Acer Liquid Z4, only two of them. This is the first one. It works perfectly fine. It is also mint condition, which is cool. Next up is the Nokia C2-01. It works perfectly fine. I really like this device. Next up is one of the two iPhone 4Ss. This is the first one. It works totally fine. It's a black one, and I really like this device. Next up is one of the two Alcatel Pop 4s. This is the first one. It works totally fine. Next up is my other iPhone 4S. It works totally fine. It's water damaged, but it works. Just right now it's dead, and I can't get it turned on to get a new screen, by the way. Here's my other Alcatel Pop 4. It also works perfectly fine, but it's fully dead. Next up is my Samsung Galaxy J1 Duos. It also works perfectly fine. It is in pretty bad condition, but it still works perfectly, except it has a bad hardware. But it has a different back cover. But other than that, it's in pretty bad condition. It still works perfectly fine. Just except the bad hardware. Next up is the Sage MI-X2. It works totally fine, but it has a bad battery, which is interesting because it has a weird charging port. Next up is my first official phone, the Nokia 20P30C. It works totally fine. I had to take off the lens, but yeah, it works perfectly fine. It is in okay condition, and yeah, I like it a lot. Next up is the legendary Nokia 3310. It works perfectly fine. I like this device so much. It is in mint condition, which is interesting, which is cool. Next up is one of the two Nokia C2-01. This is the first one. It works totally fine, but the screen's a little bit cracked. And it's on carrier T-Mobile. Next up is my only Windows mobile phone I have, the Samsung Omnia or SCH i900. It works totally fine, but has a bad battery, so I can't get the turn on right now. But yeah, it is in pretty good condition, and I like it so much. Next up here's my other Galaxy Young. It also works perfectly fine. The back is a bit damaged, so I had to go and use tape so it can go and stay together. But yeah, it works fine. It's a deep blue one actually. This one's titanium silver. Next up is one of the two modular Razer V3. So it's the first one. It works perfectly fine. It didn't came with a charger, but it did came with the battery. But that's actually for my other one. While this one actually did not came with the battery, but it came with the charger, which is actually very, very surprising. Sorry guys if I confused you all, but anyways, it works fine. I pretty like this device, and yeah, pretty nice. Next up is my Blackview A8. It works totally fine, but the screen's a little bit cracked, but it works perfectly fine. Next up is the LG Cookie. It works perfectly fine. It's my only Jabba phone that has a working touch. This one works perfectly fine. It used to be the oldest touchscreen for my collection, but no longer is. Now it's the Samsung Omnia, which is pretty interesting. But yeah, it works totally fine. I like it. Next up is the Sony Ericsson K550i. I don't know exactly sure if this thing actually works, because it also has a damaged back cover. Like, the back is falling out, but I put with a lot of tape so it can stay back together. And right now it's falling apart a little bit, but I'll fix that a little bit. But I don't know exactly sure if this thing actually works. Next up is the Motorola C118. It works totally fine. Pretty nice, mint condition. Next up is the Alcatel 1066D. It works perfectly fine. Next up is the Ace Liquidity for my other one. Now this one also works perfectly fine. Next up is the iPhone 6. It works perfectly fine. Next up is the Nokia 5310 Express Music. It also works perfectly fine. But it's dead now. Next up is the Nokia 2650. Sadly, it used to work, but now it's dead right now. It doesn't work at all. But it used to be. It used to. Next up, the reason why, because it had a contact so as prior and it only worked for 5 seconds because of that. Next up is the Nokia 1100. It also works perfectly fine. Next up is my Samsung SCH-E250. Only two of them. This is the first one. This is the E250i. It works perfectly fine. Pretty nice. Next up is the HTC THEIRSEVES. It works perfectly fine, but it has a bad battery. Next up is the HTC THEIRSEVES. It also works totally fine, but it has a missing back cover. Next up is 182 Sony Ericsson W595. This is the first one. Sadly, it doesn't work at all. It has a broken digitizer. Next up is the... oh god, the Motorola is dying now. Who cares? Next up is the ZTE Key IS Plus. It works perfectly fine, but it has a dead speaker. Next up is the Nokia 6085. It works perfectly fine, but has a broken flex cable. Next up is the Samsung Chat 335. It works perfectly fine. Next up is the Nokia 6680. It works perfectly fine. I got this one a long time ago. Most of you got them a long time ago. Actually, 50% a long time ago, 50% like a few days ago, which is cool. This one works fine. I like it. Next up is the T-Mobile Pulsar Hole A UA220. It works perfectly fine. This is the oldest Android phone I have. Next up is the Vodafone 553 ZTE Smile Q. It works perfectly fine, but the touchscreen doesn't work at all. It never did. But at least it works perfectly fine, just needs a new screen. Next up is 182 Samsung Galaxy S4. This is the first one. It works perfectly fine, surprisingly, but has a broken AMOLED screen. Next up is the Nokia 3310 3G. It works totally fine. Next up is the Samsung SCH S640. It works totally fine. Next up is the Alcatel 2051D. It also works perfectly fine. Here's my other Motorola Razr V3. It also works perfectly fine. Next up is the Nokia 6500 Slide. It also works perfectly fine, but it didn't came with the battery, and also it came with swollen battery, so I had to flew that away. But yeah. Next up is the Alcatel U5. It also works perfectly fine. Here's my other SCH E250. This is actually the E250, not the E250i. It also works perfectly fine, but it has a broken SIM tray, which really sucks. Next up is the Nokia 105 2017 edition. It works perfectly fine. Next up is my Sony Xperia S. It also works perfectly fine. Here's my other Galaxy S4. I'm using it as a main now. It works perfectly fine. It's dead now. It's a not Galaxy S4. It also works fine. Mint condition. Next up is the iPhone 5s. It also works perfectly fine. Next up is the HTC Desire 200, only 2 of them. This is the first one. It works totally fine, but it has problems at all. Yeah, it has problems, which really sucks. Next up is the Alcatel One Touch S Pop. It works perfectly fine. Next up is the Nokia 7250i. It works perfectly fine. Next up is the Nokia XV-00. It works perfectly fine, but sadly security lock, so can't get into the device at all. Next up, here's my other Sony Ericsson W595. This one finally works, so finally got a working Ericsson W595. This one perfectly works, like it works perfectly fine, but it didn't come with a charger, so I can't get it to charge now, but it works fine. That one doesn't work, that one does work, which is a good thing. Next up is 22 Nokia 220s. This is the first one. Sadly doesn't work at all. It never did. Next up is the Samsung Keystone 3. It works perfectly fine. Next up is the Nokia 2610. It works perfectly fine. Here's my other 220 by Nokia. This one actually works fine, but has a broken LCD. Next up is my Mantel 1711. It works totally fine, but this has a dead speaker too. Now here's my other Nokia C2-05. It also works perfectly fine. Next up is my Samsung Galaxy Core Plus, which also works perfectly fine. Here's my other HTC Desire 200. This one also works perfectly fine, but this one has no problems at all, which is a really nice thing here. Next up is my Alcatel One Touch 1016G. It works totally fine, but there's a negative screen, which I don't know how that happened, but who cares? It works fine. Next up is the Nokia 2630. It works totally fine. I pretty like this phone, and yeah, pretty nice. Next up is the Samsung SCH S660. It works perfectly fine, but it has a bad battery, so can't get the turn on right now. Next up is the Sony Ericsson Xperia X8. It works perfectly fine, but it's dead now. Next up is the Samsung GT1190 Coconut. It works perfectly fine, but it's dead now. And that was like the pre-last, or second to last. And finally, the last one on my phones is the Nokia 150, which also works perfectly fine, but the camera doesn't work. And there it is. So these are all my phones for May 2019. I have total guys of 68 total phones. That's crazy. I can't believe it. This is gonna be amazing. So yeah, those are all my cell phones. Like and subscribe and post notifications on the bell so you never miss any more videos. So yeah, thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more videos and peace out. Goodbye.